Hi, hello everyone. Thanks for coming back. Thanks for checking in. I'm glad you're here. So today is going to be a little bit different because I got down a rabbit hole. And no, I don't understand why is everyone saying that like the Roman Empire is all that men think about. I I I tried that and it's really boring. And I took Latin in high school, so I mean I'm familiar with a little bit of it. But because this does what I had to dig into that to look at um, Herod. Herod Antipas at the beginning of chapter 14 of Matthew. I had to get into that a little bit because I just, like I do, I just have questions and there I go. It's just whoop, down the rabbit hole I go. And I mean, who knows when I might come up and who knows where I'll come up at. Because I very rarely just dig right back up and head on. It just winds and turns sometimes. So this is a little bit different because I'm going to get into some history and that may not interest you at all. And I'm sorry if it doesn't. But this was fascinating to me. So at Matthew 14 at the beginning, it opens with we're at Herod's birthday party, Herod Antipas. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of background about Herod and who he was and who he was related to. So Herod Antipas is the ruler of the area of Galilee. And his dad was Herod the Great, who was the same Herod at the beginning of Matthew in chapter 2, who was not so happy that the king of the Jews had been born in Bethlehem, or that the Magi, you remember, he's the one that the Magi went to and they were like, we want to see this new king. We followed a star. And Herod was like, do what now? Who? Oh, yeah, I want to see him too. So that's the same Herod. He was brutal. He was insensitive. Not very well thought of. Although he really did a lot of building and really it was a very successful time in that country as being the king of the Jews. And he ended up getting that title because, and he was actually considered half Jew because his father, see, here's where I got a little geeky. Okay, get ready. His father, so Herod the Great's dad, I didn't remember his name. I didn't write it down. I didn't find it to be important. But his dad was an Edomite. Okay. And an Edomite is from Esau. Esau, remember, was the twin brother of Jacob. Remember, their dad was Isaac, whose dad was Abraham. So we have Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob and Esau. They were twins. And so Jacob's family, Jacob's line becomes Israel. His name is changed to Israel, okay? That's who Jacob is. And Esau's descendants become Edom. Thought that was fascinating. So they're Arab and they're not Israelites. He was not from that line. But his father converted to Judaism. So he was considered half Jewish. Herod the Great was, okay? He was also a Roman citizen because his dad got to be good friends with a little guy named Julius Caesar. Yeah, that one. I mean, why am I always so surprised when like actual world history lines up with biblical history? I know that's so dumb, but it's like, oh my gosh, I know him. When I'm in world history and I see something about a biblical person or a biblical place, I'm like, oh gosh, I know them. I know that place. And the same is true for, when you're reading about a historical biblical figure, and lo and behold, there's Julius Caesar. So, it's just, I know that's dumb for me to be geeked out about that, but I mean, hi, yeah. So Julius Caesar liked Herod, the Great's family. And he granted the father Roman citizenship, which was passed down to his family. So Herod the Great was a Roman citizen and half Jewish. And so that made him perfect to take over the job of king of Judea. Okay. And so this time, and this is something that it just all just really interested me. So he actually ended up being on Mark Antony's side and knowing Cleopatra, of course, because he knew Julius Caesar, right? So he knew all of this. And so he ended up being, he's made the king of the Jews of Judea. He's ruling that for the Roman Empire, and he really likes the Roman Empire, and he wants to stay in their good graces. And he's a little brutal to his people, but I mean, he really is bringing them some strong economic things. I mean, he built a lot of things. He fortified them, and things are going well economically in that sense. He was building things and whatnot. So, but it turns out I don't know if he had a mental illness as he aged, but he got a little crazy, and they think that I read something was like, that's part of the reason why he was so brutal, but then he could be so kind. But he would make really great decisions, and then he would do something just off the wall. So he had his first wife, who I believe her name was Doris, right? Doris. So Herod and Doris, he divorced her and married a woman, Mary, I can't pronounce it, Mary Main, I don't know. Anyway, he married her and truly loved her, it seems. But his sister-in-law or someone else was saying, you shouldn't trust that woman. I think she's sneaking around. So they planted that seed. And so he became so incredibly jealous and suspicious that he murdered her and her sons and a bunch of other members of her family. And so he went on to marry many more times. He had a total of 10 wives, I believe, and or they think around 10 wives. And they think, and he went and kept, I don't know how many children, there were lots, because he kept having children for 50 years. Can you imagine? That's a lot of wives and a lot of children. And not all of them did he murder. I don't know if all of them were still, and I think all of them were still, he didn't divorce all of them. He just probably got a new one. You know what I mean? Because he was king and he could do whatever he wanted. So he has, he had this relationship with, Rome. They spent a lot of time in Rome, and so his children were educated in Rome. They knew all the things, and that gets into this is where I got stuck in Roman history, because it's a lot of the times when you read things about, in the New Testament, you'll come across like Hellenistic Jews. And that means that they had, and see, this is where I got tripped up. This is when I was so frustrated, because to be Hellenistic was to have this Greek view. And what that means is it was combining kind of the two, the Gentile, if you will, or the pagan, some of the things that they were doing, combining it with the Judaism. So it wasn't a very true form of the religion, but a lot of these folks, from that area of the world, the northern part of on Italy, Rome, all that kind of stuff, those were kind of Hellenistic, and started out that way. And I'll give you an example in a minute, because I don't want to get ahead of myself, because I was so fascinated by this. But then, so they're all in Rome and being educated, his children. And so they all kind of spent a lot of time together. So, but it gets a little nutty. So when he murdered his wife and her family members, it left a lot of orphaned children, I believe. He didn't murder them, but he took them in and then espoused them to other members of his family. So his remaining sons were given wives, or some of them were, right? And one of them that was given was Philip. So Philip had was promised Herodias, Herodias, however you pronounce that, as his wife, and they were betrothed when she was like 8. So, I mean, 7 years later, and I think he was 20 or something. So, like 7 years later is when they finally got married. But but they all knew each other. So they get into this, and if you're interested, when Herod the Great dies, he leaves his stuff to 3 of his sons. And he did not want Herod Antipas to be in charge, I don't think. But it was like, I'll make him like the third and won't give him, much to be in charge of. So he gave him Galilee. But his mother, so Herod Antipas and Archelaus, so they would have been Archelaus and Antipas, were brothers, were full brothers, same mother. Their mother's name was Malthace. She was the 4th wife, and she was a Samaritan woman. I mean, there's a break from Jewish tradition right there, because, I mean, he was Jewish and he married a Samaritan, and we know that that wouldn't fly with the devout Jews, right? So she was a Samaritan woman. Then his 5th wife, her name was Cleopatra of Jerusalem. And she was very loyal to Herod, and had another son. Nobody knows what happened to him. He just kind of quit being mentioned. But her other son's name was Philip. And so it was left to Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas. And actually, Archelaus ended up being exiled. He was terrible. He was a terrible ruler. And when I say nobody knows what happened to him, it's because he was exiled to Gaul, which is current France. So that portion of the world, he was exiled there. And no one knows what happened after that, but he was a terrible king. He followed in his father's footsteps. He was very brutal, and lots of people complained against him to Rome, like, this guy's nuts. You got to get rid of him. And so he was exiled. And then there was Herod Antipas, who was a little bit passive. It wasn't bad under him, but it wasn't great. Although there was economic growth. I mean, everybody was doing pretty well while he was ruling. And he ruled Jesus's entire lifetime. Yeah, he's the same. Herod Antipas is the same Herod that we see at the end of Jesus's life, when he's brought to Herod. Pontius Pilate sends him to Herod, and Herod sends him back and says, no, you deal with this. So just keep that in mind, okay? We see how he dealt with Jesus. He was kind of wishy-washy. And he really didn't, and also, though, he also didn't want to really get super offensive to his Jewish subjects. He really, he didn't put his face on the coins. He didn't do a lot of pagan things. He kind of stuck to that, we'll keep them happy and do what we have to do. So, and then Philip, the 3rd son that was left, because it all had to be approved by Rome, and they approved these 3 to be left with Herod's stuff. So the 3rd one was Philip, and he was very kind, and he was well liked, and he was really a great ruler. He left Rome and went and lived and toured around his country, his territory, if you will. And so he was great. Everybody liked Philip. So that brings us back to getting back into who Herod was and what he was doing. So Herod Antipas, at the beginning of chapter 14, it's time that Herod heard the news that Jesus was doing all these miracles. And he's like, oh my gosh, he's John the Baptist. He's come back from the dead. That's how he can do these miracles. Because he had John the Baptist killed. He had murdered John the Baptist. And he was like, that's who this Jesus guy is. That's what, he's doing the work of John. So Herod knew John pretty well, because John really took him to task about marrying Herodias, whatever it is. He was like, that is your brother's wife, not to mention your niece. John the Baptist left that off because Herodias was Philip and Herod Antipas's niece as well. So, but he had been to it because she was one of those orphans that it was one of, their brother's children. And she didn't have anywhere to go. And so, Herod the Great took her in and said, here's who you're going to marry. Here's what you're going to do. And so she marries Philip, and then Herod Antipas comes to visit, and they see each other again because they grew up as kids. They liked each other, and they were a little closer in age, so they had spent more time together. Probably, I assume. I'm drawing a lot of conclusions here, but they knew each other, and they fall madly in love when they reconnect. When Herod goes to visit. Well, so he divorces his wife, and she divorces Philip. And they didn't like that. The Jewish people did not like that. They did not want they didn't want you to just decide you didn't want to be married to someone anymore. And so they use, we've talked a little bit about this. We were talking, at the beginning of, in the Beatitudes, in that beginning part of Matthew in chapters 5, 6, and 7, we discussed this a little bit because it was getting out of hand because there was things, Herod had 10 wives. It was getting out of hand. Okay. So it was really frowned upon by the Jewish people, all these divorces that were happening. And so they both divorced their spouses, and then they, live happily ever after, whatever. He brings her back into Galilee. And so he's ruling, and John the Baptist is like, this is terrible. You are Jewish, you are our ruler, and you are just flaunting this you're just ignoring the rules. Not only did you both get divorced, but she's your brother's wife. You cannot do that. There are laws talking about this. And Leviticus, sure enough, if you go to Leviticus, I believe it's chapter 18, it gets very specific about who you're supposed to marry and have relations with. And your brother's wife is not, is really off. They're off the list. You cannot do that. It's terrible. God felt very strongly about that when it's come from divorce. Okay. So you can't just take your brother's wife. And that's essentially what had happened. And John is just giving them down the road about it. He's like, this is terrible. You can't do this. And so Herod had him arrested and imprisoned. So remember, I think Matthew 11 is where it is that we were talking about that part, about him being in prison. We know he was in prison because he sent his disciples to Jesus. Remember talking about that? If you've not heard it, go back. It's Matthew 11. You can find it in the list of the shows. So he imprisons Jesus, and he's living that life. And so I don't think he ever hushed about it. But John also was pretty popular. And so part of the reason that Herod didn't just kill him from the beginning was he was a little concerned what the backlash would be. So he was annoyed that John was saying all of that. Probably, to be honest, doesn't that sound like conviction? Mm-hmm. He was thinking, oh, don't talk to me like that. Don't tell me that I'm doing something wrong. Don't tell me that I'm not living the way that I should. And he just imprisoned him because he was too afraid to actually kill him. Well, Herodias, I've switched my pronunciation 7 times. She hates him. She hates John. Hates him. And so there's a birthday party for Herod. And I have to read you this quote because it really got me tickled. Because one of the things when I was looking at part of the Hellenistic influence in some of the things were birthdays. It never occurred to me that the Jewish culture didn't have birthdays. I don't know if they still do, if they do now. If you're Jewish, please let me know. I'm interested in this. But they didn't really celebrate them in that time. But the pagans and the Gentiles did. So Herod, of course, being raised in the Roman courts of Julius Caesar, was all about a birthday. And so I read I found this So this is from the Catholic Encyclopedia, the 1911 edition. So, I mean, it's been updated, obviously. The writer said, in the scriptures, no one is recorded to have kept a feast or held a great banquet on his birthday. It is only sinners like Pharaoh and Herod who make great rejoicings over the day in which they were born into this world. So funny to me. Only the pagans, only the sinners are the ones celebrating the day that they themselves were born. So Herod's having this party. And honestly, when you think about it, there aren't very many instances. I mean, like, these are the two, like, there's one with Pharaoh back in the Old Testament, and then there's this one about Herod about having a birthday party. And so you don't really see it that often. There were lots of other feasts and celebrations, but not for a birthday, okay? So I just found that funny. But so here Herod is having a huge feast for his birthday. Okay, that's where we are in John chapter 14. And it says, but when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before them. We think her name is Salome. And pleased Herod so much, which the whole dancing of the birthday celebration, also very, very Hellenistic. And that probably was provocative, which, that's his, not only his stepdaughter, but also his great niece. Gross. So much so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. And having been prompted by her mother, she said, give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist. And although he was grieved, see, he didn't really want to do this, the king commanded it to be given because of his oaths and because of his dinner guest. He did not want to be embarrassed in front of his guests. He didn't want to look bad. So instead of going, no, anything else? What else would you like? Can I get you a crown? Would you like, some new clothes? What would you like? A new camel? You can have anything you want, except I'm not bringing you the head, because no, that's a little barbaric. But no, he felt that in that moment he would have looked weak to not follow up on his word. So he had John the Baptist beheaded, and sure enough, brought to her on a platter, because her mother told her, said, look, this guy's talking bad about me. And, I'd really like for him to die. I want him to go away. And Herod Antipas is not doing what he should be doing to defend me, and, things of that nature. And so Salome asked for that, and there you go. So his head was sure enough brought in a platter and given to the girl, and she took it to her mother. And then John's disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and then they went and reported to Jesus. So I just thought this was fascinating. This is the guy who, and I think that Jesus at some points, and I can't tell you the verse that it is, that he doesn't really have, obviously he doesn't have a glowing opinion of Herod. He's like, oh, that one. I think you referred to him as a fox. Like, he's sneaky. He's a little sly and sneaky fella. He just kind of does what, suits him at the time. And that is definitely true. That can definitely be said. And that's why later in Matthew, we'll see him saying, this is your deal, Pontius Pilate. You take care of it. I'm not getting involved here. I've already done that once. And we don't know the repercussions of what happened when this happened. We don't get to see that, what was the people that followed John and how popular he was. We just know that his disciples. An interesting thing too here was that was a job for the family, the sons of a person, to come and collect the body, and which I think is fascinating, that that they would let them have the body back so that they could bury it in a reverent and a way that was meaningful to them. But his disciples, because John didn't have children, his disciples went and got him because he viewed them as his family, obviously. Also, Jesus his body was not collected by family nor his disciples. It's interesting too, isn't it? So I hope you enjoyed this little foray to the life and times of Herod Antipas. And it was fascinating to me. And I don't know if you care anything about that, but it's just interesting how it all kinds of, the way it all just kind of fits together, and things that we know and things that we've been taught kind of layer on top of each other. And so it really gives a good picture of what was going on and the times and how people behaved. And it was interesting to me. I mean, I've always been struck by Herod's, I don't want to do that. Because I think Pontius Pilate does the same thing with Jesus. He's like, I have no fault with him. I don't want to be involved here. It's a little bit similar to me, but I've always wondered, and I've always been struck by the idea that they were like, I don't want to do this. And Herod says he was grieved. He was grieved to go through with it, not grieved enough to not do it, but grieved. And that has to be some conviction and some, this is not right. This is not right. But what it came down to for Herod was what was most important to him. And what was most important to him in that moment was not that he was behaving in a way that he knew wasn't the right way to do things. What mattered to him was what people thought about him. And I guess that's all of us at some point, isn't it? So don't be like Herod. Don't be like those crazy Herods. And remember that Jesus loves you.